Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Hello, and welcome to the Pros and Cons podcast, where sometimes we feel like pros and sometimes we feel like cons. I am your host today, James Healy, and joining me is Paddy.
Hi, I'm Paddy Boylan. I am a writer, writing teacher, editor, and bid writer. Don't ask what that was because it's really boring to explain.
And also Phoenix.
Hello, I'm an editor / the creator of Bent Light Writing and an agented children's book writer.
And Matan.
Hi, I'm a writer. I mostly write horror and dark fantasy. I'm known for Glyphlight and Our House, which you can find on Amazon or on my website. And I'm also an English teacher.
And I'm James Healy, and I'm an editor and writer. I'm known for Cooling Engines. And today I will also be your host. Today we're going to be discussing unreliable narrators. What types of unreliable narrators are there in fiction? Why would you employ unreliable narration in your story? And what are the tips for doing so? But before we jump into that, I'm just going to run around quickly and ask everyone, what are you reading and what are you consuming at the moment? Paddy.
I am still reading Imperium by Robert Harris, which I keep mentioning. It's great. It's great, set in the fall of the Roman Republic from the point of view of Cicero's slave. It's funny when they talk about slaves, there's so much more kind of everyday than when we think of slavery in like the more modern world, I think. Like this guy is basically his secretary. I mean, he's not free. He can't do what he wants. But yeah, they almost have like a kind of a friendship. Very interesting. Anyway, Imperium, Robert Harris, very good.
And Phoenix.
Yeah, I'm still making my way through Frankenstein, nearly there. And I'm also playing Hollow Knight now, which is the first time I played a video game in a while. Hollow Knight, very, very good. A lot of subtle world building.
And Matan.
I gotta be honest, I haven't been reading much recently. Yeah, a lot of writing and other work got my attention, but I have been watching movies. I've been doing a Tom Cruise binge recently, watching Top Gun for the first time.
What do you think?
Not sure how it aged. I tell you something, the kissing scenes are a bit much. Like, is that what we used to do in the 90s and 80s? Like, completely, never mind. No details necessary.
Is it just too
but I have watched
or what is Tom puckering too much?
It's like, are you trying to
He has that
swallow? Look it up, okay? Kissing scene. Thank me later.
Innocent Google. That's Tom Cruise kissing.
And I watched A Few Good Men. That's me, really. I've been watching Tom Cruise movies, enjoying myself.
Nice. And yeah, I'm still working my way through Children of Men. It's really, really bleak and really, really hopeless and depressing. So exactly my vibe.
Gonna say.
Yeah. All right. Let's jump into the topic. I'll just quickly explain for any of our listeners who are unfamiliar with the term. An unreliable narrator or an untrustworthy narrator is typically a first-person narrator in a story who is not relating the events in an accurate, objective, or reliable way, causing the reader to question or doubt their version of events and speculate about what may really have been going on. This is different from the author or narrator losing authority or basically seeming unauthentic because it is an intentional decision by the author to employ this tool, typically in order to pull off twists or create suspense later on in the story. An unreliable narrator can be intentionally misleading or lying, or they can be unintentionally misguided or unaware of certain things, or maybe viewing stuff through their own lens and maybe relaying the details a little bit falsely or exaggeratedly because of that. So I wanted to ask some of the gang, what are some of your own favorite unreliable narrators in fiction? And there may be spoilers for a couple of stories.
Okay, well, I'll go first because I kind of shouted this out when we were discussing it. Have you guys heard of a film called Rashomon?
No.
Oh, Rashomon. Do you guys know a director called Akira Kurosawa?
Ooh, that name sounds familiar.
Akira Kurosawa was the director of films like Seven Samurai, which you guys have probably heard of. The Hidden Fortress.
Yes.
Ran, Japanese director who does a lot of samurai films. Wonderful, wonderful movies. Rashomon, it was one of the first films to do really weird things with the unreliable narrator. It's about these people that are talking about this murder, assault that they saw. And they've got the 3 people on trial that were involved, and each of them gives a completely different account of events. And so the film shows you the same events 3 times, each from another character's point of view. And now we can hear about that and say, like, yeah, I've seen that done. That was like, that happened on The Simpsons in one of the early episodes. That's only because Rashomon did it first. Like, Rashomon was the original, and it does it so beautifully. So it plays with ideas of subjectivity and the fallibility of justice, because at the end of this, like, there's no character's account that seems, they're all obviously wrong in certain ways, but none of them seem like they're lying, and none of them seem like they have the truth. So you end up thinking, well, justice is fallible because we can't ever know. Knowledge itself is fallible because we only ever take people's word. It's a really, really wonderful example of what unreliable narration can do, and the way you can thread unreliable narration into the themes of a story. Yeah, Rashomon, definitely recommend it. And that's one of the few unreliable narrator stories where it's not a spoiler, I think, to say that there's unreliable narrators.
I have actually heard of that. Yeah, it's like super famous.
Yeah,
it's black and white, isn't it? It's like really old.
It is old. Is it black and white? I don't remember. A lot of these films are, but it's been too long. My mind is giving it Technicolor.
Awesome. Phoenix, how about yourself?
I'm not sure. I feel like this might be an example of what I would call like soft, unreliable narration. But I'd actually just finished listening to this, The Invisible Man by, what is the name? Ralph Ellison.
Yes.
Incredible book, by the way. So quick spark notes, and this also won't be a spoiler, so that's nice. Quick spark notes. It's about an African-American man who's having the veil of the subtle racism that's been woven into society, and how it's just kind of programmed in, where like some people aren't even aware of it, even the people that the prejudice is against, like, and that veil just slowly coming down and starting to see how invisible he is. And that's The Invisible Man. Very good. Like, the poetry in the book is incredible. But
I thought it was just about a guy who was invisible. Like, that's much deeper.
Oh yeah, no, I think there is also a movie about that. I forget what that movie is called. So where the unreliable narration comes in is the book starts, it's a bit like a Metroid game, or it reminded me of a Metroid game, where you start the first level and you have all your powers, and then suddenly you lose everything and you have to get all your powers back. It's kind of like that, because the book starts at the very end, where he's very aware of all these things, and he's speaking very poetically and kind of like speaking to the problem and like all these things that he's pegged down and stuff. He's like, and then you jump back to the beginning, where all his conditioning was kind of still there. And that's where the unreliable narration sort of kicks in, because he doesn't tell the story from the future looking back, where he was like, I mean, he is using past tense and stuff, but he's not narrating it as though he's reacting to it in real time. So it's very evident to the listener or reader, like, what's going on. But at the same time, the character in the moment is like confused and not sure what exactly the picture's looking like. And it adds interesting flavor to it. Mm-hmm. Would you count that as unreliable narrator? Because to me, it feels like it, but
it's not reliable.
I'm not sure. I think when we start looking at the definitions, I think we might have a little bit better an idea. Mm-hmm. But at the moment, I'm not sure if I would.
I hope so, because that's just like what the Emperor New Groove does, and I have some great points about the Emperor's New Groove later. So I'm really hoping it counts.
I have found as a definition, it's one of those definitions which is like, there's the hard center definition, but then it gets real squishy out towards the edges.
That's what I was thinking. I feel like it's a little squishy.
Yeah,
we like the squishy parts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good, and it's good for something I love about writing tips is that, like, the tips can be applied for almost anything. So it's one of those things where it's like you can go down the hard line of like, this is unreliable, but then there's also elements of that being unreliable as well. So and Matan, how about yourself?
Wow, I'm so conflicted, because there are 2 books I really want to talk about. First of all, okay, I'll start with this one. It's one of my favorite books of all time. It is by Mr. Patrick Rothfuss, and the name of the book is The Name of the Wind. And what's interesting about The Name of the Wind is that it exists on two timelines. The first timeline is the timeline where we meet the main character, quote, hope I'm pronouncing that right, and he's sitting in this tavern that he owns, and he's telling the story of his life to this guy who chronicles important events in history. And we can kind of understand that quote used to be this big guy because the chronicler really wants his story. And then the other timeline is told in the first person, whereas the previous one was in the third person. So the third person timeline, the original, the framework, is presented as hard fact. This is what's happening. I would even argue that the narrator is an omniscient narrator. So whatever we see is undisputably the truth. The third person narration, which is basically quote telling the story of his life from when he was a kid, catching up to the main timeline. It's full of exaggerations, of things that sound too good to be true. Like he's telling you this, you know the definition of Mary Sue or a Gary Stu, like this perfect hero that does everything perfect? The reason that works is because we know this is him telling us the story. If this version of the story was told unironically through the third person, I think I would cringe, because why is he so good at everything he does? But then when you jump out and the listeners actually challenge him on that, they give voice to your own personal hesitations. Yeah, go ahead, Patty.
Well, I didn't get the impression he was an unreliable narrator, and I thought he was just really, really talented. And I have a friend who read that book who actually, his biggest problem with it is that he thinks Quoth, whatever his name is a Mary Sue. So actually, when I was prepping for this episode, I read that one of the problems with an unreliable narrator is sometimes, if it's not clear, it can just come across, I think, James, you were talking about it, like just inauthentic, or maybe just like clumsy writing. So yeah, I didn't. So you think it was an unreliable narrator in Name of the Wind?
I think he's not super blatant with it. He's not calling you out. But if you look closely, there are so many hints of places he either changes. Like there are moments, I believe, with what's her name? Dani?
Oh,
it's been a minute. It's been a minute.
I'm sorry, his love interest. She's great. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the name, and he tells something, and then the listeners kind of look at him like, "Are you sure that's what happened?" And he's like, "That's all I'm saying," and he moves on. And you're like, he just gaslighted me. He gave me something that's obviously not the truth, and we're just moving on with the story. I would consider quoting the Name of the Wind an unreliable narrator, because he's telling us everything from his point of view. And because, first of all, some things he might not remember, some things he's just embellishing. So yeah, I thought that was a very good of a gentle, not too obvious, unreliable narrator. He's not telling you the opposite of the truth. He's just giving you his version of it. And there's another one I want to talk about. I'll just name drop it here, but The Life of Pi, which we might get to later.
Spoilers.
The Name of the Wind is it's a cool example, because it's like an unreliable narrator, but the reader's very aware that they're unreliable. It's an unreliable narrator who's admitting to being unreliable, basically, because when he's describing the love interest, I remember that part, they call him out on it, and he's basically saying, or the person, one of the people listening, because he's like, the most beautiful woman I've like ever, like, basically.
Yes.
And the person listening is like, I mean, she was beautiful, sure, but she wasn't like whatever. And basically just calling out like his subjective preference, and like she was beautiful to him. So it's known to the reader that they're getting a subjective point of view, but at the same time, that when you go back into the story, that is the only view you get. So it's like this is how it's described to the reader, and this is the version of the story they have, but they actively know that they're getting something subjective. And that's called out, I think, a few times.
I think that's a great word choice, Phoenix. Subjective storytelling. And once it's done right, and it feels like the writer is in on it, not like the writer is doing it because of a lack of skill, I think it can be a lot of fun.
It's a big creative license. You could do you just have a lot of fun once you're openly subjective, out of the closet as subjective.
Yeah.
My example, just because it's spoiler free at the moment, is Children of Men. The book is written from first person and third person, from the same character's point of view. The first person version is him writing in a diary, and then the third person just comes in now and again, but begins to become in more and more as the story went on. And I couldn't figure out at first why they were doing that. And then around midway through the story, the character is he's kind of doing some shady stuff, and he starts to feel like he's under investigation, or that he's being watched by the kind of dictatorial, almost fascistic government that's in place at the time. And he starts to acknowledge in third person that the events that he's relaying in first person, he's almost like shaping them in case he's ever picked up and in case the journal is picked up. So it starts to make you question some of the stuff that has been said in the journal.
Is the journal then like, everything's fine? Like, dear diary, nothing of note
Everything's
happened
fine.
today.
I didn't break
I
the
was a
law.
law-abiding citizen. But is that kind of what it starts to do?
It doesn't start to take any different shape, which is why you really start wondering, what has he left out and what has he reshaped? Because it just feels like the narrative feels normal, but he's kind of just basically stated to you, I'm hiding some stuff. So you're kind of like, oh, what's happened, or what's taking place? How involved is he really? Okay, so what I'll do is quickly explain the different categories of unreliable narrator, and then just see if I can give examples as well. So the two types of unintentional unreliable narrator is the naive or the outsider. And this is typically someone who, through a lack of experience, or maybe because they're young, is relaying information in a way which you as a reader understand is like, oh, that's maybe a child's perspective on something, or someone who doesn't have all the information. And so their understanding of events is a little bit misguided. It can also be an outsider, which is someone who is maybe has come into a new town or into a new culture and is misinterpreting things. And this might be something that you are aware at the beginning that they're misinterpreting things, or something that you learn as the story goes on. And so an example of a naive is one that, Matan, I think you've read this, so I was wondering if you'd bring this one up, is Christopher John Francis Boone from The Curious Case of the Dog in the Nighttime.
Wow. That's a book I can talk about.
Yeah,
I think that definitely goes into the naive, unreliable narrator. It's just the way he sees the world and the things that he cannot see, and to us are obvious.
Yeah, just for context, Matan.
Yeah, that book, the Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night is the story of a young teenager discovering his neighbor's dog has been skewered by a pitchfork and deciding that he's going to become Sherlock Holmes and find out what happened. But what we discover pretty quickly, as this story is told in the first person, is that our detective is actually autistic. He's on the spectrum, and the way it is written is extremely unique, as it is supposed to convey what it's like to be told a story by someone with that condition. I have seen some people criticize the book for saying that it does not accurately represent certain elements of the syndrome. As someone who knows close to nothing, I have really enjoyed the book. I thought it was greatly told. But yeah, basically what happens is that you're in a scene and some things are very obvious to you. Like it's obvious to you, for example, that this character is having an affair with the other character. But the guy telling you the story, he's completely blindsided. He has no idea. He's giving you the hints that make it obvious for you, but to him, he does not draw that conclusion. Only you do as the reader.
Nice. The second type of unintentional, unreliable narrator is what's referred to as the madman. And this is basically someone who has lost touch with reality in some way. So the events that they're detailing are not, obviously they're not accurate, but maybe you don't realize at the beginning of the story, you start to figure out later on. The example I'll give for that, or the two examples I give for that, and these are spoilers for two films. So if you don't want to hear the two films, switch off.
You won't know which film until you hear the title.
If there's anything out there you don't want spoiled for you.
Anything at all.
Yeah. They've been out a while, so I feel most people who wanted to see them have seen them.
Is A Beautiful Mind one of them?
No.
It should be.
Okay, please continue.
Oh, that is actually a great example, yeah. A Beautiful Mind, Fight Club. Yeah.
What was the last
sorry,
one?
what was the third one?
Shutter Island.
Yeah. I knew you were going to bring up Shutter Island.
Yeah.
I think it's, like, I know I read it in the last year, but it's kind of a classic example.
We have to go back to Fight Club, because Fight Club, I believe, is one of the most exquisite rug pulls in film history.
Yeah, it's a good, they set it up really well. In the book, you're almost told quite early on that potentially Tyler Durden is a figment of his imagination. It's still a bit of it feels like a twist, but you kind of, something's up from very early on.
As you're someone who's read the book and seen the film, do you think the film did that better by withholding it from the audience for so long?
Yes. Personally, I really, really like the film. I think the film takes everything that works in the book, puts that on screen, and then kind of just improves a lot of it. in the book they meet on a beach rather than in an airplane having a normal conversation. So it feels very abstract and strange. And then the beaches kind of symbolize, I guess the shore symbolizes the mind and stuff like this. So everything about that scene feels off. And then from that point on, they're in conflict. So it very much feels like the ego is in conflict with him. On the contrast to that, I felt like the twist in Shutter Island was not very well done in the film, whereas I felt in the book it worked so well because the details that the character is noticing it's very minimalist. That's all the information you have. I see you shaking your head.
I will have no slander of Shutter Island on this podcast.
Not good. Not a good film.
It was great, James.
I gotta watch that movie again.
I don't think that's a good rug pull at the end. I feel like if the film shows you a gun and then later on says, no, it was actually a wooden gun, I'm like, no, you cheated because it's third person. So
James, I think your standards are too high for us. Like,
yeah, probably maybe.
He's wearing a black turtleneck. I mean, you have to respect the authority.
Listeners, if you want to hear James and I disagree about films for half an hour, check out our Oppenheimer James vs. Patty episode we just recorded.
I just listened to it yesterday. Very good, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we will definitely just do an episode where we sit down and argue about films, Patty.
I'm not sure if you would consider this an example of the Madman one, but it feels pertinent. Memento also
yes
in there. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah,
I can't remember the exact like kind of what information the viewer has at what times, but I know there are definitely moments where he's narrating moments and you know that that it's a very skewed lens.
Yeah, I get from the beginning because the film is done backwards. So
yeah, okay.
For the listeners who aren't familiar with the film, Memento is a film about a guy who has short-term memory loss and is searching for the killer of his wife. But every scene happens in reverse. The film happens in reverse order. So every scene begins with zero context. So you're in the same shoes as the character, not knowing why he's here, not knowing what's going on. So because of that, there's so much information withheld from the audience. Yeah, so I definitely think I'd include that.
I want to take us, if we have time, I want to take us behind the curtain for a second. And I want to go to Patty's example of A Beautiful Mind, because I think this gives us a chance to really look at the different things you can achieve as a writer by using an unreliable narrator. Because A Beautiful Mind, and for example, if anyone has watched The Father, the recent movie with Anthony Hopkins, he's got Alzheimer. The narrator is not as much unreliable as much as he's trapped in an unreliable he's got this unreliable lens almost glued to him. He cannot escape it. That's the central conflict of his story. He's as much a victim of it as we are, in a way more than us. And it elicits pity from us, and we want to see him overcome that predicament where he's stuck in this. Because imagine, like, your eyes, your ears, your brain being an unreliable narrator to you. Like, these are the tools you have to see this world, and you cannot trust them. It's a movie much more about paranoia and about, in a way, Shutter Island also falls into that category, and I guess Fight Club. But on the other hand of the spectrum, we have the unreliable narrator that is meant to add tension by withholding details from us, and therefore strengthening a twist or a revelation. It's not a narrator that doesn't know, it's a narrator that doesn't tell. And that's the difference I wanted to emphasize for a second.
I would actually argue, though,
I will just to tidy up, because I've gone a little loose with my definitions. Really good point, Matan. And as you were saying that, I was thinking that Memento and A Beautiful Mind, they might not count because film is third person. And because when you're watching the films, you're trusting what's happening. So it doesn't create that sense of tension. Whereas Fight Club in the first person of the book, it does create that tension because you start to figure out that the character may not be entirely correct. Whereas in A Beautiful Mind, you realize that his events weren't quite accurate, but it doesn't necessarily create that same tension as you're watching it up until kind of the point that you do realize. Actually, no, it would count. I'm thinking you realize, and it continues happening after you realize it happened. And just the last two, just 4 types altogether.
Do you mind if I jump in quickly with my disagreement?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. If you imagine A Beautiful Mind as a book, it would probably be written in third person close or third person omniscient, right? But it's still third person close or third person omniscient narration. And I would argue that because the narrator, if they're omniscient or even if they're close, because they quote unquote know they're not a person. It's just like, you know, the eye of God narration that is common to story. If they know that there's some information that isn't true, not going to spoil too much, and they're not telling you, I'd still say that's unreliable narration, even for Fight Club. I mean, this is all just like definitions and it's fuzzy.
Definitions, but I think the issue with third person narrative is that it has more authority than first person. Because if you're writing from the perspective of someone in first person, we end up in that area where it's easier to end up looking like it's an issue with losing trust in the narrative rather than losing trust in the character. So you would typically try to do an unreliable narrator. This is just from a writing point of view. You would try to write an unreliable narrator from first person because the fault is with them and their perspective of events. Whereas if you're doing a third person, where is the issue? It seems more like things are inaccurate, or that the author is actually trying to lie to you in order to pull off the twist.
So I'll say with James that I agree with you. I do agree that the third person does create. I'm actually agreeing with Patty too. It does have a bit more authority. With that being said, I think that writers, if you're listening, which I hope you are, that's not a bug. That's a feature. If you do the third person correctly, and you're consistent. Let's look at A Song of Ice and Fire. Close third person. It is third person. It is far from omniscient. It is far from all-knowing. We only know and see what that character sees. He just chooses to tell it to you in the third person. We have thoughts in italics. We only see what the character... It could have been in first person and the narrative would not change in the slightest. Okay, you would still get the thoughts. You would still see the same things. Third person does convey more authority and does make prose look like fact because it's the third person. He walked, he said, he did. But that doesn't mean you cannot produce unreliable narration with it. Just keep in mind what James said. It could look like you just don't know what you're doing if you don't do it right. It could look like your prose cannot be trusted. So take that into account.
I was going to argue for Beautiful Mind being unreliable as well, just because it is, to me, if I'm remembering the movie correctly, it's more of a tight third person, where in the sense that you do spend a lot of time with just the character, where your perception is modeled by the character's lens alone. And the only difference is you have the veil is pulled off very hard at some point, to the point where it's no longer unreliable and everyone's kind of aware of it.
Yeah, no, I think I've forgotten that it happens in like the middle, and then he continues to have he continues to see things for like a good portion of the film.
What a movie!
So I'll just point out the last two types of unreliable narrator, and these are the more intentional types of unreliable narrator. Is the liar, who was just the character who was just straight up giving you the events in a deceptive way, or intentionally omitting important events and kind of hiding things. And then there's what's called the piccolo, which is the character that's prone to exaggeration. Patrick Bateman from
the what?
A character who's prone to exaggeration.
No. Before that, the nickname.
The Picaro.
Like from Picaro.
Yeah.
Is that like a literary reference?
Not familiar with the term. I don't know where that comes from. Picaro, Picaro. But that's just a character who's prone to exaggerating, or prone to maybe grandiosity, and maybe bigging themselves up and making them seem more important than they are, or maybe kind of like making other people seem crap when they're not that bad at all. And then there's the liar, who is just someone who's lying through the narrative.
I have an example of how the Picaro can be used to really good comedic effect, and also not so much to deceive the audience as like, yeah, we know you're full of shit. Okay, sorry, I mentioned before, The Emperor's New Groove. You guys seen The Emperor's New Groove? James, do you like The Emperor's New Groove?
I actually do. Yeah, great film.
Hey,
it's so fun. It's so fun.
What's not to like?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. There are these moments where you can see things happening on screen, and yet the main character, Kuzco, who is our protagonist, is narrating things completely to the opposite. Like he's saying, like, I'm a very caring and reasonable person, while he's like kicking an old man at like the top floor of his like 100-story palace. So he's an unreliable narrator just to let us know that, yeah, he's kind of full of shit. He's kind of got a sense of himself, and for comedic effect. But there's no way, it's not fooling anybody. So yeah, the unreliable narrator doesn't always have to be like a big kind of Shyamalan moment. It can also just be, telling us something about a character.
as far as liars goes, I did want to go back to The Life of Pi. Has anyone watched the movie or read the novel?
But
I read the
Yeah.
book.
I saw the movie.
So I did both. I read the book and then I watched the movie. And when you think about it, I really like movies or books that are based on a true story. And allegedly, this is what it is. It is a story of a man who was stranded at sea on a lifeboat for close to 300 days with nothing but a Bengal tiger. And at some point, he also had a hyena, a zebra, and an orangutan on the boat with him. And you go through the story for the most part, and I think there are parts that it becomes a bit more fantastical, like when he gets into the island and he eats a lot and monkeys chase him, I think. And
Meerkats.
you do, yeah, meerkats, thank you. And then you start to doubt it, but then he gets to the end and he meets the doctors after he emerges from his odyssey, and they ask him like, "Is that really the truth?" And then I think the movie does that really well. But he just kind of looks them in the eyes and he says, what if I told you that the orangutan was my mom, the hyena was someone on the boat, and the zebra that the hyena ate was someone injured? And then we had to kill him. And basically, 3 murders were committed. My mom was killed in front of me, and the tiger was just my alter ego helping me stay sane. Which story do you prefer? And he doesn't tell you which is the true, but I think you walk out feeling like, yeah, I've been lied to probably, but I feel better for it. It just, I thought it was really well done. He kind of, because throughout the story I was building up this case of, this is probably true, this is maybe not true. Okay, what's happening here? Where are all these meerkats coming from? And then the fact that he addresses it in the end and with such maturity, like a gut punch, really. I thought that was really well done, and I enjoyed that part.
Yeah, that was a great twist.
Really good. My example for liar, I think everyone has seen this, is a Gone Girl.
No, I actually haven't.
No, don't spoil it for me.
Spoil
No,
it,
spoil
but
it.
go watch it. It's good. Without getting into too many spoilers, the way that the book is written puts you in a place where you're not necessarily trusting what the main character is saying, and then about midway through the book, a second character pops up and their version of events is different. So it creates like you have 2 seemingly unreliable narrators, and it creates this great sense of tension and conflict throughout the rest of the story. And it works really well as a film as well. So go watch it, and listeners, go watch it as well. It's very good. By David Fincher, who's my favorite director.
James, you're so good at not spoiling movies.
Oh, good.
Yeah, that was deft.
I get really annoyed when someone says like, "Oh, I'll just tell you real quick about the thing," and I'm like, "Oh, don't spoil it." And like, "No, I won't," and they completely spoil it.
Oh my gosh, I've had that happen so many times where it's like
so irritating.
All right, I'll just tell you this one thing. I'm like, no, when I say nothing, I mean literally tell me nothing. I want nothing. Like it's like, oh, just no, that's something about the movie. Tell me nothing. Like as in, we stop talking about it now.
Yeah.
Like nothing.
Yep.
Yeah. Or it's like if someone thinks, "Oh, I'll tell them this," and they won't be able to put it together, and I'm like, I have to figure out the end of the movie based on what you've told me. Like,
yeah.
That's my pet peeve.
Now I know there is a twist. Thank you.
Yeah.
Damn it.
Yeah.
You've ruined it. I'll spend the whole film watching it now being like, where's that twist I heard about 5 years ago?
A real quick tangent, super quick. So I was watching the movie Her yesterday with Joaquin Phoenix. And my friend Jack, you guys know Jack from the right group. Hi, Jack. He just told me that he was traumatized by the end. That's it. That's all I knew. And I walked into this movie knowing that whatever happened in the end, Jack was traumatized by it. And I'm just waiting. Are these guys going to fucking kill themselves? What's going to happen? No spoilers. I was not traumatized. So
I didn't find it traumatizing myself.
Neither did I.
Me neither. But imagine you
different.
watching the movie, waiting for it to abuse you. And it just didn't happen.
Jack is an unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
I want to make a point about, we talked a little bit about like third person omniscient and close and unreliable narrators. I mean, maybe it seems obvious, but I want to make the point, third person narration probably is not the way to go for unreliable narrators, because there's the expectation as a reader or a viewer that the third person close or more often omniscient narrator is telling you God's truth, right? That we trust it from the outset. If there's no sense that the narrator of a book is a character, and you just think, oh yeah, this is just the background narration telling exactly what's happened, and that turns out to be an unreliable narrator, that's probably just going to break your trust in the story. Like if there's no reason for it to be an unreliable narrator, like they suddenly turn to the camera and say, or was it? That would be very strange.
Third person omniscient would be very difficult to do it with. I actually don't even know how that would work without it just being a break.
Not sure.
Yeah,
I don't think so.
If you're also trying to write a character who is very removed from what's going on, either because they're misguided or because they're just very, very wrong, if you're trying to show their perspective in third person, it does start to feel like it's the arterial authority is saying these things. So it starts to feel like this is what the author thinks rather than necessarily this is what the character thinks. I think like it can be done right, but you're running into a lot more trouble trying to pull that off in third person than if you just did first person. It would just flow really naturally. So I think if the focus of the story is to employ unreliable narrator for a twist or for suspense or for some point in the story later on, it would just make so much more sense to go first person. Whereas you can like Game of Thrones, I know in one of the opening chapters, Bran walks in on the Lannisters having sex, and because he's a kid, I think he doesn't quite figure out what's going on, but you as the reader immediately know what's going on, and you know how much trouble he's in for having seemingly walked in on that, because they're royalty and he's not. So he's not reacting to that the way he should be, and you're already like, oh, get out of there. And then as well, we kind of move into like very, very squishy territory where seemingly anytime a character is misguided in their understanding of things, this can start to technically be called unreliable narration. So in the Prisoner of Azkaban, in the Harry Potter series, because Harry thinks Sirius Black is a dangerous criminal who was likely involved in his parents' death, and he spends most of the story like running from him and trying to avoid him, this can technically become unreliable narration because he was misguided and kind of given the wrong information, and that makes the narrative have a certain flow. But that, of course, is third person as well.
I would actually argue that Prisoner of Azkaban, in that sense, would not be unreliable narrator. I would just, because as far as we know, that is the truth of the book. Because to me, unreliable narrator has to place intentional doubt. It's kind of like, I like to think of it as like the author having a conversation behind the narrator's back with the reader, like dropping them, like placing things that will intentionally have a different meaning to the reader than it will to the character, so that the reader can see the dissonance between the perceptions. Whereas in the case of Harry Potter, the information the reader has and the information Harry has is the exact same. So there's we're going through true. That is just that's the true plot of the book, and then it's just a twist that changes context looking back. Whereas in other examples, there are these little twists where something's not right, something's off about the situation, and so the reader's slowly diverging from the main character, or it's explicitly called out, like in Emperor's New Groove, where it's like we just hear the difference in what they're saying, and it's creating contrast.
Yeah, for me, I wouldn't think of that as hard unreliable, but when you start to soften out the edges and see the same, because a lot of the same writing techniques are used in order to pull off the unreliable narrator and that twist with the Prisoner of Azkaban, because it has to have some element of his behavior throughout the story having been consistent with him being like both of those things. But like you said, it doesn't create any tension in the story, because it is the truth, and then the truth was different. But you have little bits along the way where you're like, it also makes sense that he was that.
Yeah, true.
So, but it is very, like I said, very squishy out along the edges. That kind of thing.
I just want to say that I agree with Phoenix that not every time someone is wrong, he's an unreliable narrator. I really like how you describe it as a conversation behind the narrator's back with the author. And in general, I enjoyed reading books where I feel like the author is in such control that they're doing these kind of things on purpose. But I will say this, I'm not sure if we can call it unreliable narration, but I think especially in third person writing, when we're doing the tight, the close, like over the shoulder third person, we should aspire for all the writing to be subjective, because I think subjective description is description that characterizes the narrator. A narrator that just tells you the house is red is one thing. A narrator tells you that the house looks neglected, informs you about the narrator and the house in much deeper ways. And I think I like the style where the third person narrator is maybe not unreliable, but obviously skewed. We can see that in Wolf Hall in the way the narrator describes the world. This one is smart. This one's an idiot. This one is pretty. This one has been slipping around. He doesn't know these things. He thinks these things.
And it's always third person as well.
Yeah, it is. And I think there's something very mature about writing third person that way, rather than just going into the easy choice, which is first person, because that is the easy choice, right? I thought she's smart. I thought she looked stupid to me. But if you trust your reader to get it, and if you're consistent, I think that's a great thing to do in the third person. But like James has warned a few times in the podcast, you got to make sure you're consistent. Otherwise, the reader will start to question whether you know what you're doing and whether you're doing it on purpose. Because if you head hop, if you write things that your narrator wouldn't know, if you let him read the mind of other characters, it just doesn't make sense for certain things to be described in a certain way.
That's the art of tight third to me, is that it is this subtle line of you need to be able to separate. And I tell this to a lot of people I'm editing for, is like, you need to clearly separate your voice as the author from the voice of the narrator, or the voice of the main character, or the voice of the narrator from the voice of the main character, especially if you're dealing with like really difficult topics like sexism, racism, or something. You can have a character that has that, but you need to make sure that your voice as the author is distinct from their lens on the world.
Yeah.
And by doing that, you show that, oh, you yourself are not racist or sexist, but you're highlighting their skewed lens. And you can then comment on that if you've properly separated your voice. And the same thing goes for like unreliable narrator sort of things, or even just subjective descriptions, is you need to make sure that you know when the character is giving input, and you know when the narrator is taking a brief step back to kind of give you something a little bit more objective. And once you have that separation in the voices, that's when you can start having conversations with the reader that the character is not really aware of. It's like you're kind of like taking a step back and whispering something to the reader and then going right back in. And it's not always easy to do, and it's very subtle sometimes. But when pulled off well, it's really cool.
That was good advice, Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed that.
I noticed because we brought up this topic yesterday, and I was like, oh, unreliable narrator, so cool. And as I was thinking about it, I realized that I actually found two of my own stories that use it quite heavily, and they're both horror. I don't write horror very much, but not recently, but like I found two examples of horror where my trope that I lean on is an unreliable narrator, where I plant something in the beginning that gives the reader immediate doubt that this lens is going to be a little bit milky, like you don't know what you're looking at. And that's where the tension comes from.
Yeah, I guess there's something unsettling about not knowing where the solid ground is in a story. If you don't quite know what's true and what's not, I can see how that plays into horror.
Mm-hmm.
But you could have like a save the cat moment. Well, save the cat is about showing that your hero is heroic, but you can have a save the cat quote unquote moment showing that the narrator is unreliable, like Phoenix brought up in The Name of the Wind, where he describes the woman as the most beautiful woman in the world, and his friend's like, yeah, she was okay. If you do that early, you give your reader an anchor, like to know where they stand. Like, okay, this guy exaggerates, and from now on, they know how to read this. If you do that early, I think it's easy to follow.
Definitely. Yeah, I think I found from like the little bit of research I've done for this is like subjectivity, like you were saying, Matan, is a huge part of it. And when you take even third person characters and like write from their perspective, if it's subjective enough, you can kind of call almost anything unreliable narrator. The term starts to get really loose as you move out.
Yeah.
But yeah, exactly like you're saying, the few techniques for employing unreliable narrator is to have them get like caught in a lie or caught in a mistake or being inaccurate kind of early on in the story, where they say something and then the narrative kind of proves that thing to be not true. You can also change POV, like in your example, Paddy, the Rashomon story, where it's different points of view retelling the same thing differently. Also just making the character like an outright liar, whereas if they're lying to other characters, then you can also speculate that they might be lying to you as well if they're doing it often enough, or have them intentionally omit a certain detail, that should have come in chapter 1 or 2, and then bring that up in chapter 4 or 5, where they're like, okay, listen, this is actually what's happened, and that's why I'm here, as well as having muddy and shifting motivations, which is kind of almost like breaking a golden rule of a character, because you want to know what they're after. But if it seems like what they're doing is shifting around a little bit, it starts to give you a sense of not being able to figure out where they're going. As well as, like you're saying, Matan, have them engage in like a questionable act very early on, where you're kind of just, I wasn't expecting you to do that at all. It makes them kind of unpredictable and a little bit unreliable.
So long as it's obviously used as a device, because I could see that also just coming across as like, oh, that's clumsy writing.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
It's true to everything, really. That's true to everything.
Yeah, just write good, right?
Just write good. Just get good.
Ali mentioned in a previous episode this idea of hanging a lantern on something. I think it's an idea of, she's going to kill me for not remembering. What's the name of the author I'm thinking of? Doesn't matter. Yeah, Phoenix, please.
Oh, it's just like hanging a lantern. It's like the idea that you call attention to something to let the reader know you're gonna circle back to this. I'm putting emphasis on the bar of soap for a reason. And it goes back to like an example I gave a long time ago about telling a story. You picture, like, reduce it to you go to the mall and you come back to tell your mom about a story about what happened to you at the mall. What context does your mom need in order for the big drop at the end of your mall story to make sense? Or you don't have to go to the mall, it could be anywhere. So it's like, if you're writing a story, the exact same thing goes. You need to call attention to the things that the reader needs to know in order to understand the significance you're trying to get across. So, and if you're not calling attention to the things, if you're not planting the bits of context they need to know to understand the character's shifting intentions, that's when it comes across as what we're talking about as clumsy writing, when it comes across as random to the reader, or it comes across as like, why are they doing this? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So if there's a character that's doing something that seems out of character and you want that to eventually be part of the clue that they're unreliable, draw attention to that. Don't just like have it as a small thing. Make a big deal of it and make it like a dun 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 moment. Hang a lantern on it.
I will just make 2 or 3 honorable mentions for Unreliable Narrators. It's not so much a spoiler, because I think everyone has at some point read The Catcher in the Rye, but Holden Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye. Oh, okay.
Shame.
And I still want to, so maybe I'll just pluck my ears from it.
Well, without spoiling the story, Caulfield is an interesting example because he hits all 4 types of unreliable narrator. He manages to fall in all 4 of those places, as you kind of figure out as you're reading along the story. And James Joyce is one of the early Western employers of unreliable narrator. I think he is accredited as being the person who kind of brought it into Western culture and Western canon, and he started to employ stream of consciousness kind of stuff, where the characters were very close perspective, and they started to realize that they weren't necessarily to be trusted. And I think Sally Rooney, who wrote Normal People and Conversations with Friends, employs a similar tactic of a kind of stream of consciousness kind of thing, but where you start to realize that the point of view characters are maybe not reading things as well as they necessarily could be. And Paddy, I believe you have a quote for us.
Yes, James, I do have a quote. Sometimes I think I am the unreliable narrator of my own life. Sometimes I think we all are. And that is by Alice Feeney, who wrote His and Hers. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We have been the Prose and Cons team, and we hope you've enjoyed this episode. And Matan, remind me, where can people find the new Mythic?
Well, I'm glad you asked, James. Actually, you can find the new Mythic on Amazon.com, and you can also look up our website, precipicefiction.com, where you can find links to our books and many other stories written by our Precipites, and also get a lot of podcast-related content. So look us up. Also, if you enjoyed our podcast, please leave a review anywhere you consume your podcast. That really helps us. And see you next time.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.